Good afternoon, everyone. This is Prue Lawrence. I'm the Managing Director of Qt Australia, and we're very excited to bring you our Take Control of Big Data webinar. Thank you all for your support and for registering for today's session. Okay, hopefully you can all hear me. To make sure that you can, make sure you've selected mic and speakers, and that's in the audio drop-down box there. If you can't hear, click on test next to mic and speakers just to make sure that you can hear us coming through your speakers. Check that your volume is turned up and not muted as well. If you still can't hear us through your laptop or over the mic and speakers, there should be the telephone number that you can call and dial into the conference. So you can listen to it either over the internet or over the phone. If you still can't hear, please let me know. There is a chat or question function in the panel to your right. I can see if there are any questions being asked or if anyone is having any troubles, and please let me know and I will try to rectify that immediately. Just for the rest of the presentation, all participants will be muted during the webinar just to reduce background noise, because we do have a fair number of you on the line and we just want to make sure that everyone can hear what's going on. Before we begin, just to let you know that the webinar will be recorded and the recording will be available to download from our website before the end of the week. Like I said, you can contact us directly with questions using the chat or question function on the panel there. Please feel free to send me questions as the webinar continues, and we will endeavour to respond to those questions throughout the session. We'll also be posting a poll throughout the session. We like it to be as interactive as possible, so get ready to respond to the poll as that comes up. And finally, you can continue the conversation on Twitter. I have my trusty colleague Nicole here who will be tweeting with the hashtag QtBigData, so keen for you to continue the conversation. So just a very quick overview of who are Qt. You might have heard of us before. We have had a rebranding. We were Scilutions, and last year, actually just a year ago, almost to the day, we merged with Qt, who are a global psychometric testing provider. So for last year, we were Scilutions Qt Australia, and from April the 4th, we became Qt Australia. We are an online psychometric and competency assessment organisation. We have a full suite of technical and knowledge skills tests, an automated online video interviewing system. We do have a global reach. We actually assess about 7 million candidates a year. All of our tests are available in about 40 languages, and we have offices in 24 countries. So we're excited to be in Australia and excited to be part of the webinar today. So, who are the presenters for today? You won't be hearing from me till the end of the session. I will be handing over to two of my lovely colleagues today. First one is Katharina Lochner, who is the Professional Services Director for Qt in the ASEAN region. Katharina has had a long history with Qt, has co-authored parts of our assessment suite, and has also carried out a lot of the data-heavy analysis in Qt globally. We'll also be hearing from John McLaughlin, who's our Commercial Director for Qt in the ASEAN region, and he has a keen interest in data, which is highly convenient, seeing we are presenting on big data today, its application in selection and development processes, and ultimately how data is used as a driver to inform and underpin the way we do things going forward. So we are a truly global webinar today. We have both Katharina and John in other parts of the world. I'm sitting in my office in not so sunny Melbourne, and I will be handing over soon to John and Katharina, who are in hopefully much sunnier Singapore. So what is our agenda for today's session? Just a brief overview there. We're going to have a look at what is big data. We're going to talk through the hype cycle, where is big data currently sitting. We're going to then look at where the data comes from in big data, how you can use big data in psychological assessment, how we can link big data to HR and business, and then what you as HR practitioners can do with big data right now based on some of the case studies of what we're already doing. So it sounds exciting. I will now hand over control to John, who will take us through what is big data. Take it away, John.
Okay, thank you, Prue. Yeah, I think the slide is just loading. There we go. Okay, fantastic. Yeah, so thanks for the intro, Prue. So just to get us started, I think without actually looking at any of your social media profiles or your digital footprints in one form or another, I think you've all heard of the term big data in one form or another before. It has been the buzzword over the last year and a half, and it surely created fascination in all types of businesses for data, which usually has been a rather grey and boring area, really. Now, this really has been an interesting phenomenon in terms of the transition that has taken place, but what does it mean? In short, big data refers to massive volumes of structured or unstructured data that we collect through different channels and forms that is so large that traditional data analysis methods just simply don't do the trick anymore. So things like an Excel sheet just won't do the trick in terms of the analysis. But luckily enough today, we have new sorts of programs, etc., and the data processing horsepower really that is required to process these data volumes in different ways and forms. And actually here at Qt, we are quite proud of some of the ways that we have used big data so far to create intelligent assessment and development systems. But that's sort of what we're looking at the end of the webinar. So let's get back to the theory part of big data. So what you see here is we have several types of data, including structured and unstructured data. Structured data is easier to deal with, and you could think of it as data presented in the form of a spreadsheet. So we know what to do with structured data, and correlations and conclusions from structured data are easier to derive. It is unstructured data that presents the bigger challenge. So how do we make sense of our email inbox, for example? So are we really restricting ourselves to one topic per email conversation? And do we identify that topic clearly and consistently in the subject line? And do we all do it in the same way? The answer here is definitely no. I know people who write the entire message into the subject line to give you an example, and then halfway through they realize you might owe them a $5 or $2 from last week, so they pop that into the actual email body. You know, so you can see the problem with classifying unstructured data in an easy way. You know, the data sets have the tendency to become quite complicated very quickly. So really the challenge with unstructured data is making sense of it and introducing a level of structure into it to use it and derive conclusions from it. And this is where technology comes in, and this is what we've seen over the past year or two, how unstructured data slowly is becoming somewhat more accessible. So what are the characteristics that define big data? Sorry, I'm just trying to move the slides. There you go. So big data is probably easiest defined by the 3 V's. I think the slide is still loading somewhat. Oh, sorry, it went too fast now. I skipped ahead to the hype cycle there. Prue, can you go one back?
Sure, no problem. There we go. Or just make sure you still have control.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Sorry about that. So big data is probably easiest defined by the 3 V's. So that's volume, variety, and velocity. So nowadays we deal with, well, not just megabytes, kilobytes, gigabytes, but we deal with petabytes of data that come in from all sorts of different sources and formats, and the pace that this data is coming in at just keeps on increasing. So to give an example, Twitter creates 80 megabytes of data in the form of tweets per second. You know, so you can, or you can think about any UK, the United Kingdom, with their country covering CCTV systems, with the cameras everywhere. The amount of data that captures is just incredible. And then the big question then, or the big challenge is, you know, how do we deal with the 3 V's, and in particular, how do we extract value from all of that? And this is what today is really about, presenting ways to use data that is, to a certain extent, readily available to you, and to create a more efficient organization in terms of performance or even decision making. So we want to give you a glimpse of the power of big data, first on a personal level, and what your digital footprint might say about yourself, and then how you can in the future apply similar logics to your own organizations. So then to the hype cycle. So yeah. Okay, great. So the hype cycle is a tool developed by Gartner. It's a graphical tool that represents the maturity, adoption, and social applications of specific technologies. So it tracks the progress of technologies from the first peak of hype through the inevitable crash, then onto what it calls the plateau of productivity, when mainstream adoption begins to take off. So currently, if you look at that, so actually last year was probably the peak of inflated expectations. Everybody was only talking about big data. Big data was everywhere. But currently we're probably moving towards, or hopefully are moving towards, actually the slope of enlightenment. But we're still squarely in the valley of disillusionment, which means that its applications for the wider population are still a little bit further away, which means that there's still an economic, or there's still a considerable cost associated with using technology related to big data. So then we're looking at some sources in relation to big data. So where does it actually all come from? Okay, so just went too far ahead again. So there we go. So where does it all come from? Well, you know, we know that big data comes from a variety of different sources. If you remember the second B, so these include your own social media footprint, your personal email trails, or your work emails even. So any information that has been captured in even video games or any online knowledge sharing sites will feed into this. You know, it's the same goes, as I mentioned before, CCTV systems or public transport systems. They capture structured and unstructured data too. So what accounts for most of it, however, is the unstructured consumer data. So you'll see here we can see, or what we can see here actually, is the exponential growth of data that we captured over a 10-year period. So you can see that this is all underpinned by the rapid decrease in storage and server costs. So all of a sudden, from 2005 to 2015, the amount of data we're able to capture and store has risen or grown exponentially. And the light blue actually indicates the unstructured data pad. And as is obvious from this chart, it accounts for the majority of data we are capturing today, as well as going forward, because this trend will only continue, and this type of data that we're collecting will only grow. So interesting enough, consumers will create 68% of all the unstructured data by the end of 2015.
Okay, that's great, John. What I'm going to do now is hand over the control to Katharina, and I will also unmute you as well, and we'll talk about how big data is currently being used in psychological assessment. Katharina?
Okay, thank you, Prue. Yeah, so here you can see a little cartoon that probably illustrates very nicely what the big data thing is about. So right now you have collected 250 terabytes of data, but then the question is, what does the software actually tell us? So really the big challenge in this is making sense of the huge amounts of data that we have. Yeah, so what does this all mean for psychological assessments and talent analytics? So what we first need to do is look at the theory. So if we look at it from quite a simple perspective, there are two ways of dealing with data in general or in any research really. So you can start out by drawing up a hypothesis and set out to prove this right or to prove it wrong. So I think all of us might remember this from science class or from research papers they have come across. So that is pretty much the standard thing. But then the other way, and maybe the new way in which we can analyze data, as now thanks to technology, is to work without any hypothesis. And so we can use technology and software, and that can help us detect patterns in the data. And then we can use these patterns to formulate models and predictions without really knowing what might be thrown up as part of the analysis. So maybe you remember the time when you had a chemistry tinker box as a child, and then you might remember just randomly mixing different mixtures, hopefully without ever, having anything explode. So that's pretty much what happens now with the modern methods of analytics. So, for example, hang on, I am just trying to move this on. Yeah, oh, no, I'm going too fast. I'm going back. Seems to take a while for the slides to, here we are. Okay, so what some guys at Cambridge University did, pretty much like what I explained just, was they were not necessarily formulating hypotheses, but rather they looked at different types of behavioral data that were readily available, such as Facebook likes, for example. And Michal Kosinski and his colleagues David Stilwell and Thore Grapel found that these Facebook likes actually predict accurately a range of different personal attributes. The sample size here was 58,000, so that was pretty large. And these were people who allowed them to access their Facebook likes, demographic information, and they also completed a set of psychometric tests. So what they found, you can see here on this slide. So on the left-hand side, you can see the accuracy with which they predicted dichotomous attributes. So that is attributes where you're either the one or the other. So for example, you're single or in a relationship, or you smoke or you don't. So mind you, the probability of getting this right by chance is 50%, right? Because it's 50% being either the one or the other. So when you look at the first one on the left-hand side, single versus in relationship, 0.667 is not that great. But then if you look at, for example, Caucasian versus African American, that's 0.95. That's almost 1. So that's almost a 100% accuracy of predicting whether you're Caucasian or African American from your Facebook likes. And pretty much the same with gender. So that's the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side, you can see some of the more complex attributes where on which you're higher or lower. And also here you can see that you can predict with quite some accuracy for example, your age or your openness or your conscientiousness. And the areas that are a bit lighter than the others are the accuracy with which the questionnaires actually predict these attributes. So the questionnaires that were specifically designed for assessing these attributes, like, for example, intelligence or emotional stability. So you can see these Facebook likes, which are basically just one click, are pretty close in their accuracy of predicting intelligence and all the other attributes that we can see here. So this is, this caught some media attention. And here in the next slide, we'll show you some more findings that they have. For example, participants took an IQ test, and the results are highlighted here. So Kosinski and his colleagues found that liking Morgan Freeman's voice or Mozart, and surprisingly enough, curly fries are the type of likes that predict a higher IQ. And then on the other hand, liking Harley Davidson's predicts the opposite. The interesting thing was that after this study, which captured quite some media attention, after that study was published, the likes of curly fries went up quite a bit. So that, was quite an interesting effect. And here you can also see that you've just got some attributes in there that you wouldn't think of as being predictive of high or low IQ. So that's actually what is special about these methods of analysis. We've got some more ideas for you. So for example, being spontaneous is predicted by you liking sites such as Join It if you're fat, or dying, and unsurprising is somewhat liking accounting is indicative of you being well organized. So I'll go on to the next slide. Here, for example, people with many friends like Jennifer Lopez, and the dollar you're holding could have been in a stripper's butt crack. On the other hand, people with fewer friends like The Dark Knight, Minecraft, and the In-N-Out burger joints. Well, and people with few friends, they like walking with your friends and randomly pushing them into someone or something. I mean, it's quite hard to have a lot of friends if you like to push them into someone or something. So basically nothing they can do about that, I guess. Okay, here we've got a few more examples. Emotional people would say of themselves sometimes, I hate myself. So that's not very surprisingly, but also they like the Addams Family or Donald Cobain. And emotionally stable people say they, for example, like skydiving or mountain biking. So that's kind of a surprising thing as well. On the next slide, we have words used in Facebook status updates, which they also looked at. For example, introverted people use some of these words at huge amount, like anime, computer, internet, and so on. And we've got some more words that extroverted people use, so people who are outgoing and who like to be in contact with people. So as you would expect, they use love, party, tonight, weekend, nights, and so on. So that's, just words that extroverted people use. And if you like, you can also try this yourself by simply going to the page youarewhatyouLike.com, and then you just need to allow the website to get access to your Facebook data, and then you can find out to what extent you're open, conscientious, extroverted, agreeable, and stable. Okay, so I hand back over to Prue.
Great. Thank you, Katharina. That is fascinating, and I actually wish we could spend more time on that, because that is the really interesting aspect of big data and how it is currently being used, and the potential for which it can be used in the future. We will now hand back to, what we'll do now is actually launch a poll. So I want to hear from all of you out there on one of our questions. So I'll launch a poll now. Hopefully you can see this. So I'll give you a few seconds to answer the question about whether or not your organisation is currently using big data for HR decision making. Got some people putting some answers there. Just give you a couple more seconds. All right. Let's now close the poll and have a look at the results. So the poll is closed and I'll share the results. So you're obviously now seeing the results. As you can see, the answer, does your organisation currently use big data for HR decision making? 27% of you said yes, which is a great statistic. So it's a third of all attendees are working with organisations that use big data and HR decision making. 60% said no and 13% said not sure. So it's great that you've all participated in that, and that will now actually lead us on to the next and final section of the presentation, which is all about how we can use big data and the data that we already have in the HR decision-making processes. And John, I'll just check, but you should still have control of the keyboard.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Drew. Okay, so, after all this, after we had an initial overview of big data, how it's used, where it comes from, etc. So, the question really I suppose on my mind anyways, would be, what's the field that would most readily benefit from big data? Is it marketing, is it the government, or is it society at large? This is, a good question, as it seems to have so many different uses. And surely, if we can get a computer to analyze data without even telling it why in the form of a hypothesis, do we really understand the full potential of big data yet? So, from what we could see there from Kosinski's work, we're able to predict someone's preference essentially for Coke over Pepsi using their social media data. And similarly, from a government perspective, we might be able to predict people's likelihood for tax evasion, and governments could target these people easier for closer supervision. So these are all possibilities. Society at large, could also benefit if we could identify traits in people that predict antisocial behavior, such as the likelihood of engaging in crime-related activities. So really, who benefits most? I think, or we think, big data holds value for everyone in its own way, if positioned and used correctly. And that basically brings us to our key point for today. Big data also holds incredibly value for the HR function and the way we will go about our jobs as HR practitioners in the future will or may change based on the outcome of big data, or based on how we use big data. So, some of us just there in the poll identified that we're already using big data in recruitment and development strategies, and as we found out, we also know that unstructured data is more difficult to use, but we already capture a lot of structured data, as part of any assessment process, as part of any development process. That type of data already exists. So the question is, are we applying and using the findings of the structured data that we already hold? So that sort of brings us back to the hype cycle. Yeah, great. So as mentioned, we're somewhere in the valley of disillusionment at the moment. So in layman terms, that means that the technology to use big data is still somewhat inaccessible, or rather expensive. So Gartner, who developed this tool, also stated that we're about 5 years away from using big data in the most efficient manner, or the most effective manner. So until then it might make most sense to use what we already have or already collecting in the form of structured data usually. So, and in the next part of the webinar, now we're going to look at some organizations and case studies that showcase how organizations use data to create intelligent and flexible processes based on the analysis of trends and data within your organizations themselves. So the first thing we're going to look at, is intelligent high potential programs. So across the globe, we work with a variety of organizations from different backgrounds, including finance, aviation, engineering, and so forth. So we not only assess people for recruitment, but also for development. And what is interesting then is how all this data we collect as part of developing staff can feed back into intelligent systems that subsequently adapt based on trends identified in the data itself. So to illustrate this further, we wanted to highlight a high potential program we run for global financial institutions. So this is what you see here, the diagram. We collect data at each of the different stages, all assessing different elements, including past performance, potential, actual work-like behavior directly observed in group settings, etc. So, and furthermore, we collect this data globally across a large pool of hypos, so from a whole variety of sources and the different types of formats. So before we go on to the next part of the study, we need to revisit best practice consideration in relation to hypos. So you know yourself, if somebody has been identified as a high potential in your organization, you would always want to keep that person in one shape or another. Does that mean that he or she has to become the CEO? In general, no, because not everybody can be CEO. So a hypo can be an excellent contributor to your organization in many different ways, and some may flourish in a specialist role rather than a leadership role. So really, your hypo program should always account for the different career paths available in your organization in order to maximize the retention of your hypos and further increase their effectiveness. So what we build for these type of organizations are systems that take in all the data from all different assessment points, plus any data collected beforehand, performance, etc., or even the application stage, as far back as the application stage, on participants as well as previous participants. So these systems are calibrated against internal career possibilities going forward, matching people to their ideal career paths. Now, of course, as we go along, we collect more and more performance data on these people, and our systems can be further calibrated, and the more data we collect, the more trends we can identify. So in a sense, we built a mini career guidance system that evolves over time by itself in real time, that ensures the top performers stay in the organization and work in the roles they are most suited to. So, and it is these top performers that feed back directly into the system in real time, thus creating an internal quality check and keeping the system up to date and relevant at all points in time going forward. So that's sort of how data is being used within that particular financial institution. The next case study we have is actually two case studies in one. So that deals with, so that deals with recruitment and truly global companies. So we work with a variety of Fortune 500 companies, for example. And one thing they all have in common when operating as global companies is the difficulty of enforcing global standards while maintaining local responsiveness. So we're going to look at KPMG here in Singapore, and then we're going to look at a company called Belden, which is a telecoms company. So, so enforcing these global standards and maintaining local responsiveness, that starts already when you recruit graduates in different countries. So how do you compare job starters in a fair and efficient manner if there isn't, basically there's no common grading framework in place globally? So this is exactly the question KPMG asked us in Singapore. And what we that is what we looked at for them. So we assess about 3,000 candidates a year for KPMG in Singapore alone. And by now, we have collected a substantial data set that allows us to draw conclusions on their graduates. So we set out our hypothesis and analyzed the data accordingly and found that our aptitude assessments correlate significantly with the GPA results from universities. So by logical extension, this means that we can use our tools as a replacement for GPA scores for applicants that come from countries where the GPA system, for example, does not exist. You can imagine that in the wider Southeast Asian region, for example, frameworks will differ substantially. So that is actually a great thing. So now we have, so basically that is a way that we have identified that we can implement a global quality standard for KPMG. But I guess the question now is, does this data set alone really qualify as big data? In the strictest sense, the answer somewhat is no, as we learned earlier in terms of the 1V, the volume by itself. But we assess more than 7 million candidates a year, and all of a sudden the data set we really look at is much larger and much more diverse. And we have more and more data points to look at, which really allows us as a company to make some pretty good determinations around what predicts what in terms of background and recommending standards for companies to implement as a measure of quality control, especially when certain offices are acting as regional or global hubs. Yeah. So then the next piece to this case study then is, so this addressed the global standard. The next question, or the next point, addresses the local responsiveness. Okay, so, the question here that Belden came to us with was, what if being a manager in China requires someone completely different than in Germany, let's say. So can we answer this reliably, and what does that mean for implementing global standards, just what we discussed earlier? So the good thing is that we have a good idea as what the answer is here. We recently completed a study across America, Asia, and Europe for Belden of our assessments. And we found some really interesting things across gender, with men being more competitive and women more cooperative across all regions. That's somewhat unsurprising, I imagine. Americans, on the other hand, are more convincing, Asians more pragmatic, and Europeans more open to change. So really the study threw up some interesting data points around gender and regions, and really what it told us was that if we implement one global standard, there is a potential for adverse impact, and we need to consider this adverse impact when we implement global hiring standards or development standards, because we want to minimize that we want to minimize the adverse impact on any particular grouping of applicants, of existing employees, etc. So we need to account for the differences between people from regions, countries, gender, backgrounds, etc. So in short, what we did for Belden was that we created an ideal global candidate. So this is somebody, just to give you an overview, an idea now, this is somebody who is less team-oriented. So that's good for the men. That's not so good if you are from Asia. It is somebody who's focused on facts. So that is very good for Europe. It's somebody who does not desire power as much. So this is really good for the women. And somebody who is proactive. Again, good for the women and good if you're from Asia. And then, of course, there's quite a few other factors feeding into this now as well. So we just wanted to give you a brief overview. Their global standard. So, what does it mean then for an international organization looking at these two case studies. Can we both be global and local? Short, absolutely. All you need to be is flexible, and your systems and assessment processes need to be equally flexible and adaptive to minimize any adverse impact a global standard might have. So this is where that actually brings us pretty much to the end of this case study and our last slide.
Great.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so looking at this webinar today, we think that recruiting and career planning, so development, could essentially be optimized and reach its full potential by or through using adaptive systems similar to the Intelligent Hypo program. So systems that are able to learn from the data they collect and thus become more and more accurate and predictive. So furthermore, like, I suppose the world we live in today, is characterized by an ever-changing job landscape. If you look around you, you see certain jobs don't exist anymore, new jobs come up, and we're dealing with a more and more internationalized or globalized world. So we ourselves, with our practices, need to adapt to that, and we tend to have the basis for getting these processes or these change processes started right at our disposal, usually in the form of structured data that we have collected in the past or are collecting right now. So we essentially know, that is like, as HR practitioners within the organizations, we essentially know what makes people successful within our organizations and in their roles. And we can use that knowledge to create intelligent and adaptive assessment models and systems from the outset. And that all comes in the form of structured data. However, looking at unstructured data, ultimately, it should also feed into these models and systems. But as we identified as we looked at in the hype cycle, this might be more costly to achieve in the short run. So the unstructured data, using that as part of assessment and development, is probably still a little bit further away. But overall, in the future, I think big data, both structured and unstructured, may well form the basis for the way we hire staff and develop our people. And this type of data will come from, as you've seen, from a whole variety of sources, including digital footprints or the results from assessments in all of different formats, development processes, etc. And all of these will feed into one model for recruitment and development that will continuously update and adapt itself based on the feedback from all stakeholders involved. So that's it from me, and I think that brings us to questions.
Yes, that's great. Thank you, John. That's been excellent. While everyone out there thinks of some questions and sends us some questions, I also want you to think about the slide that's sitting on the screen now. So when you walk away from here, I want you to think about if your organisation is ready for big data. I want you to think about how you can make better use of the data you already have, building on the case studies and what we've spoken about today. And like John was just mentioning, how you can improve your selection and development decisions by analysing the data you have, feeding the results back into those processes and then tweaking them accordingly. So hopefully you've been able to see how you can already use the data you already have in a structured way. From an unstructured point of view, we'd like you to think about your own digital footprint and how this is currently being used to engage you as a consumer, and then maybe how this data in the future can be used to engage you as an employee. So there's lots of things to think about there. And if we just have a look to see if there are any questions that have come through. John or Katharina, we've got a question for you. Do you think that big data will replace psychometric assessment? Ooh, that's a controversial one. What do you think, Katharina?
No, I don't think so, because both big data and our classical psychometric assessment, there are some overlaps, but they also test different aspects. Like looking at big data is usually looking at the past, so what you have done in the past, what you have liked in the past, and so on. But what we do in psychometric assessment is we actually assess potential. So we take a snapshot of a person at a certain point in time, and then we predict from there their potential for the future. So there is some certain overlap, but I think using the two together might make a lot of sense.
That's a really good way of looking at it, actually, that big data looks at what we've done in the past and psychometric testing looks at what we've done in the future. And I think if we go back to that slide from the Gazinski study in the University of Cambridge, it really showed how when we combine the Facebook likes and then the intelligence test or the personality test, how that can build on each other. So that's great. And okay, there's another question.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yep. Another question that's come through, and then we'll wrap it up. Hey, this one's for you, John. What's the main reason why big data is not used by HR? We just like to have the big questions here on our webinars. John? I think maybe that question's so big, John has fallen off his chair. So, Katharina, is that a question you can answer? Okay. I think the audio connection has been restored there. I'm sorry for the radio silence. I'll just add that question. What's the main reason why big data is not used by HR? John or Katharina, either of you would like to take that question?
Okay, I'll take it.
Great.
So I think, yeah, I think that can pretty much be answered from the life cycle that John showed, because we're at the point at the moment where we're actually able of doing such things in principle, but there are no best practices yet, and it's still expensive. There are not many people who are trained in it yet, so we're at the moment at a point where there's a few people out there who actually know how to do it, and they're more on the science part of the world. And I think it will still take a while just to have best practices and all of that established, so that it's really ready for use on a large scale, and also for being beneficial or for making things better or easier on a large scale.
Great, absolutely. And I think it was even Gartner who came up with the hype cycle, the big data hype cycle, who said that we're probably a good 5 years away before we get into the plateau of productivity. And I think that's really tapping into your answer there, Katharina, that at the moment big data seems to really still be in the analytics and the technology. It's still focused in that phase, and we're still struggling yet then to apply it to HR.
Yes.
All right, well that's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you also for your patience as we manage this webinar from all corners of the globe. So we're excited that you were part of it with us, and we thank you for registering. We will send you out the slides and a link to the recording if you're interested, and feel free to pass this on to other colleagues who weren't able to attend today. And we will be in touch for our next webinar, which will be in the end of July. So I always feel like a radio announcer. It's goodbye from me, it's goodbye from Melbourne and from Singapore, and we will see you all again soon.